Hello and welcome to BloombergQuint. Over the last few weeks, the few conversations that we've had in the run up to Budget 2021 have all been laced with an underlying theme, that theme being the widening inequalities as a result of the COVID crisis. As Joel Stiglitz had written recently, or in about September, this has not been an equal opportunity crisis. Inequalities have widened between nations and within nations. What we're trying to do in this conversation is try and understand the data that tells us the manner in which inequalities have widened, and then talk a little bit about how that should inform policy choices from here on. We are veering away from our usual plan of having a conversation with a single person and getting a one-on-one conversation going. Joining us today are three people from the Azim Premji University, because they've all been looking into this issue from different aspects. So we are welcoming onto the show Arjun Jayadev, professor at the university, Amit Basole, associate professor at the university, and Rajendran Narayan, assistant professor at the university. They've all been studying the data over the last 6 odd months, and then will hopefully help us understand what that data means for policy choices. Let me first thank all of you for joining us here on BloombergQuint. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Arjun, I'm going to start with you because I hope to bookend this conversation with the macros. I think it's very clear globally and then within India that there were underlying inequalities which have persisted for years, some for decades. And what the COVID crisis seems to have done is add a layer atop them. And make perhaps policymakers, or hopefully policymakers, acutely aware that this is a problem which at least in some ways needs to be chipped away at. Is that the perspective we should enter Budget 2021 with?
Thanks, Hira, for having us. Yes. Look, I mean, it seems quite obvious from looking at the current crisis that it's exacerbated really very clear underlying trends in the Indian economy. And of course, as you said, globally, you've seen these trends happen. I think, for those of us who've been watching India over the last maybe 7, 8, 9 years, the decrease in growth, and in particular, the problems that we have with inclusive growth have become more and more manifest. What we had hoped for was the ability for us as an economy to develop particular strategies, particular paths in which we would be actually absorbing this so-called demographic dividend, this 30-year period in which our demographics work to our advantage. But of course, in the last 10 years, we really have not been able to grow in a way that is inclusive, which is widespread. And we've been focusing, if you will, for the, as Ashoka Modi put it, the construction finance growth model. And that seems to have now really run aground. And the question that a lot of people have been asking is, what next? How do we think about the next sources of demand, the next sources of growth, and so on? What the pandemic has done is really establish how vulnerable people who were even included in the past growth story are actually on the ground. I mean, especially laborers and migrant laborers and so on who've been in cities and so on, have to go back as a result of the pandemic, are the ones who've seen the most brutal crushing of their incomes and their opportunities. So certainly, I think that is the correct perspective to be looking at things going forward.
I will start to get into the data, and Amit, let me come to you, and then I'll come to Rajendran, because you all were kind enough to provide us a host of data that you have been working with. One number which is thrown out very often is that the 20 to 30% of the bottom income earners have been the worst hit, but much sort of gets hidden within that number. Amit, you want to tell us a little bit about some of the findings, for instance, from the CMI data that you have studied? Let me start first with perhaps just the ability to get jobs back. I think the CMI survey suggested that about 66% of those who went into the crisis with jobs have managed to get them back as of, say, November or December.
Yeah, so that is sort of the broad headline number, if you will, from the CMI Consumer Pyramid Survey. Now, that average does hide a bunch of variation along important dimensions. And one of the two sort of important dimensions to flag in respect to the recovery are gender and age. So what we've discovered is that both with respect to the likelihood of losing work during the lockdown or even subsequently, and the likelihood of gaining work if you've lost it, they both vary a great deal and particularly affected our younger workers and women workers. For example, to give you just a sense of the variation, even during the lockdown, women were twice as likely to lose work than men. So if you look at if you follow workers as CMI allows you to do in a panel, then men on average actually emerged unscathed to a higher degree than women did. Of course, the losses were large. Even on average, half the workforce was, had lost work during the lockdown. And then in the recovery, similarly, if women were more likely to lose in the lockdown, they were less likely to gain in the recovery as well. So they've been hit both ways, and it's the same way with younger workers. So, for example, for recovery in December, you find that the CMI data shows that men, only about 13% or 15% of men are sort of still in the no recovery side of things. Actually, what you're showing now on the screen is our survey, which I'll come to in a bit. But yeah, so if you look at this is the CMI data. So if I finish the point I was making, maybe about 13 to 15% of men remain in the no recovery sort of phase by December, but for women that number is much higher at about 50-55% who haven't recovered. So these were women who were in the workforce last year, lost work, and have not yet found work. So we are looking at a fairly large number there. The second big effect, so the one is just sort of in terms of loss of work and recovery. The second is what you're showing on the slide now, which is the precarity, the increase in precarity. So if you look at a reference point pre-COVID, which is December over here, and we look at only people who were salaried, right, which is the relatively better off of the Indian workforce. We are not talking about self-employed workers or casual workers. We're talking about salaried workers. We find that as you go into April, August, and December, which is each bar, you'll see that a sizable chunk of these salaried workers are no longer salaried. They're either out of the workforce or they are in informal work, like self-employment and so forth. So, and that number, unfortunately, which expectedly grew during the lockdown and later when people went into fallback options, hasn't really taken off into December. So you still see that continuing into December 2020, a very large fraction of people who were previously salaried remain out of the salaried workforce. They're either out of the workforce altogether or they are in some kind of informal employment. So both in terms of loss and recovery, but then what is the nature of the recovery? That's also equally important to ask. And what we are saying is that the recovery has been accompanied by an increase in precarity. So in the CMI data, the last number I'll give you, at the overall level, about half the workforce is self-employed, which is sort of what matches what everybody's understanding of the Indian workforce is. That has now grown to 65% of people being self-employed. And self-employment here can be seen as a sort of fallback option when people are not able to enter the regular workforce.
Okay, just for the sake of our viewers, I think there are three data sources you will see on the screen. One is based on the CMI survey, one is the Azim Premji livelihood survey, and then there was the SWAN network. And Rajendran, let me just bring you in there. Are the findings broadly from some of these surveys, when they're correlated, more or less similar? The message being beyond the numbers that it was the urban workforce that was most impacted. While some percentage, say 75 to 80%, depending on which survey you go by, has come back, there have been two trends within that. One, it hasn't been equal for all. Two, the extent of informality has increased, and hence the hit income may remain even if you have managed to find work back in these 8 to 9 months.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. As in, I think regardless of the survey, the thing is, even if you focus on a representative survey, so for example, CMI that Amit talked about, and we as part of Hunger Watch, for example, which is part of the Right to Food campaign, we've been focusing on vulnerable communities particularly. And what we see over there as well is that the depending on the income bracket of the set of people you spoke with, the people with the lower income bracket, when I say lower income bracket, I'm talking about what their earnings were prior to the lockdown. They were the most badly affected compared to the income bracket at higher levels. So regardless of the survey, what you notice is that there is a disproportionate adverse impact on the poorer sections of society. And in fact, even as per our survey, what we noticed is that about 43% of them who had no income in the month of April and May, out of them, only about 3% have gone back to income levels of what it was before lockdown. And 56% of those who had no income in April, May still didn't have any income in the month of October when the Hunger Watch survey was conducted. And once again, nearly more than 60% of them had reduced income compared to what it was before lockdown. So this is part of the Hunger Watch survey. But then you pick up any survey, you can look at the APU survey that Amit talked about. You can look at the CMI. Everything, I think, the numbers are pretty much in the same ballpark. We are talking about reduced income for nearly 2/3 of the population, and a much more disproportionate impact on the lower income group. In fact, as part of the Stranded Workers Action Network, which emerged during the peak lockdown period, what we noticed was that despite the orders of the Ministry of Home Affairs, which was made on the 29th of March, where the Ministry of Home Affairs categorically said that employers must pay their employees during lockdown period, what we noticed during that entire period was that only 4% of the migrant workers who reached out to SWAN were paid by their employers. The remaining weren't paid at all. So given that during the lockdown, most weren't paid, that the inertia of that carried on till much later as well.
Arjun, help us put this employment situation in the context of the recovery. So, some of the other coincident data that we've been tracking, indicators by various brokerages, etc., seem to suggest that a large part of the formal economy is at about 90% upwards in terms of pre-COVID levels. But what we have also seen through this entire period is that there was very steep cost cutting, at corporations, at least the larger ones, and perhaps even steeper at the smaller ones. So employment does seem to be far lagging some of the other indicators which are suggesting that the recovery and the rebound is on track.
Yes, I mean, this way, Amit really should also chip in, but that's my understanding too, that, and this is not abnormal, that when you have shedding of labor in any kind of crisis, it takes some time to actually absorb that labor back. So this is another case for for really suggesting that while that happens, there's a lot more, focus on things like income support or broadly welfare schemes, because it will take some time, as with any recovery, for employment to lock back. And by the way, the historical kind of record in many countries when you have this kind of thing is that it often is the case that you really don't go back to trend. And so in a situation where we were already facing employment problems, and we weren't actually absorbing as many people as we should, this problem becomes much more acute.
Amit, comment on that, and I have two questions actually pertaining to two of the graphics. If we can pull up the CMI graphics, I was curious to know, one, why you or what you think are some of the causes for the stark difference in the data for women. And also, if you can highlight on the sort of the informal work, the fact that informal work would have picked up a little bit more than the formal work. The message there is uncertainty on the recovery, perhaps?
Right. So on the women, I should start by saying that in the CMI data, we see a lot of flux, even in normal times, as far as women are concerned, in terms of moving in and out of the workforce. And that, that could be a result of not having secure employment. It could be a result of asymmetric division of responsibilities at home. There are many constraints that women face that men don't face, which might show up in the instability of employment, even during normal times. So to what extent has COVID exacerbated that, women's already existing vulnerabilities and instabilities, versus, are we seeing just something that always exists in the workforce, but now much worse because obviously, of the size of the shock? That's something that actually we are still working on. We are not yet sure exactly, whether there's a differential COVID impact here, or whether we are seeing something that is already always there. So that's as far as women are concerned. And that really suggests to us that there's a lot to be done as far as women's stable integration into the workforce is concerned, right? There's a lot of debate around female labor force participation rate, increasing it and so forth. Now, it's one thing to, from the supply side, say, more women should be in the workforce, which is fine. But then equally important is the demand side, the labor demand side of it, which is what are they doing? Right? What kind of work are they engaged in? And I think what this told us is that the kind of work that women are doing is very easily sort of the, first fired, last hired kind of work, which again, the youth also do, which gives you that differential impact over there. So as far as women and youth are concerned, I think that is part of the story. And as far as the, Actually, what is the second question you asked?
The fact that the informal jobs are coming,
Yeah.
or there are more informal jobs now, perhaps is just a consequence of the uncertainty that persists.
Yeah, I mean, the way we read that is that, when you lose your job, you do something to earn a livelihood. And as Rajendran was saying, there's several months of lost income we're talking about. In the Mint article, that is just out today, we've tried to quantify that, and it's alarming. Right? On average, we see that household incomes over the entire COVID period have been down by 25,000 rupees, total, which is over a 1 month's income. And for the lower decile, that's 17,000 rupees of lost income, which is 3 months of their income. So if you look at so much of income losses going on, people have to do something. And the classic sort of picture we can have in mind, and this has happened a lot even where I live in Bangalore, is that people who used to drive Ola cabs or other kinds of jobs like that, which were reasonably secure prior to the crisis, are now doing something like selling vegetables, or opening up any kind of simple retail or something like that. So that shift that you see, where people just do something to survive, is what shows up here as the increase in self-employment share that I was talking about earlier.
Okay. Now I'm going to move on to the food and nutrition side in a minute, but let me sort of round off the conversation on the policy, prescription that is often spoken about. I'll start with you, Rajendran, and please, feel free to jump in, any of you. I think, the only idea out there, or the obvious idea out there, is an urban Manrega. Much has been written about it, supporting it, but there are equally enough sort of, reasons to sit back and at least think as to whether we can put the systems, the pipes in place. One thing that stands out to me, Rajendran, is that, look, we can put an urban Manrega in place to help us through future crises, just like the rural Manrega did for this crisis, for instance. But from a timing standpoint, that is not going to help us right now. It takes months and years to get systems set up to be able to provide that kind of job guarantee support.
See, I think so we've written extensively about the need for an urban employment guarantee program. Now, I don't think we need not straight away think of it as an act and roll it out with all the critical provisions, the kind of critical provisions that Narega has. Having said that, I think there are still some it's a good idea to kickstart a program like that in the urban context itself, because many people who have come back to towns, and just adding to the point that that Amit was also mentioning earlier about women, what we notice, again, this is anecdotally based on interactions with many people, is that employers are not willing to employ women in the same manner that they would like to employ men. So there is definitely a dearth of women participation from the employer side as well. Now, an urban employment program, which somewhat acts as a support system, as a social protection measure, not just as an employment program, but also as a gender program. So I think the two of them together, it's never too late to do the right thing. So I think there is no point in waiting forever and waiting for that correct day to launch an urban program. I think the situation is ripe for an urban employment program at the moment, because what is happening is, if people are not absorbed in any kind of employment opportunities right now, then again, if we go back to the food and nutrition example, what we see is that there is a massive reduction in the intake of food among the lower classes. And in particular, the quality, it's not just the amount of food that people are consuming that's gone down, but also the nutritional quality that's gone down. So combined together, if this sort of a pattern continues for a more extended period of time, then we are actually staring at a much more stunted society. And if in fact, as the graph you're putting up on screen right now, we are talking about 71% as per our survey. Again, 71% of them have reported that their nutritional quality has worsened in the month of October from what it was before lockdown. And after December, I think post harvest season, the rate of unemployment is going to increase, because now is the time when many of them would not have, even if they were relying on some kind of agricultural labor, let's say in the month of November and December, post harvest, what are they going to do? How do you absorb that entire set of workforce who were dependent on agricultural labor, who were dependent on Narega? So if they have to come back to cities, if there aren't enough opportunities, and urban employment, we can think of the government as being another player in the entire marketplace offering employment opportunities, and let the workers decide whether they want to take up an urban program as part of the government, or if they want to take up any other private employment. And I think the time is perfect. I don't see any reason. They can roll it out in phases. For example, Jharkhand government has launched one. Odisha government has launched an urban employment program. Similarly, Himachal. So various state governments, and Kerala has already been running an urban employment program. So there are many state governments who have initiated that. So we can definitely learn from how these state governments have launched a program of that nature and see how we can replicate it across other states. And it's definitely a doable thing if there is political will to doing such a thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those state-funded programs are not sort of very well funded or very large. I'll come back to that hunger data, but Arjun, Amit, you want to jump in on this debate on the urban sort of rural urban employment guarantee kind of scheme? I'll throw out 2 points that two economists we spoke to earlier said. Both were opposed to it. We'd spoken to Sajid Chinoy in the context of macros, and he said that look, we had an underlying job program. A job insurance is not adequate. You have to create long-term jobs, and for that, rather sort of push resources into capex infrastructure. Indira Rajendran had an entirely different concern. She was saying that the quality of sort of infrastructure that gets created in rural areas, nobody focuses on that, but you can't do the same in urban areas, and the pipes take too long to set up. Amit, Arjun, do you want to jump in on any of those concerns?
So maybe I can just start, and Amit can also respond. So there's two things I'd like to say. Right at the outset, I agree with one thing you said, Ira, that right at the outset, if things are taking time, we need income support broadly, right? For the time being, even if we're not able to get urban employment up and running, I still think we ought to. We need income support and other ways to actually provide for supporting people who have been hit very badly. I think there's no question in my mind that if we are able to create inclusive growth and long-term good jobs and good quality, like Sajid Chinoy suggested earlier, that would be great. We've been waiting. We've been waiting a decade, and that's the issue. And it seems quite clear that the places where jobs were being created, but clearly insufficiently, are in urban areas. It's also the place where we actually see some of the worst hits to income. So in that sense, while we would like to have an extremely vibrant, private job creation, I don't see that as happening. And if we did have that, it would still make it would still make an urban employment guarantee scheme viable, because you would not have to undertake that much expenditure to make sure that those people who the guarantee was provided for actually get that employment.
Amit, you want to jump in on that?
So let me very briefly, divide up between the COVID context and then a general context, right? So the long run. In the COVID context, beyond all the numbers, what are we really seeing in qualitative terms? We are seeing reasonable fraction of the workforce that was not affected, okay? And that is the top 10% or whatever, which was able to work from home and so forth. There was a large chunk, about 70% or so, which was affected very badly, of which about half are still being affected. So the COVID survey that we did, about 30 to 40% is the people who continue to be out of work in December. So we're talking about several months of loss of earnings, particularly in urban areas and so forth. Now, in that context, as Arjun said, the immediate thing is to fill in that gap, because the long run consequences can be difficult. For such a hole in earnings, you can have kids withdrawn from school, you can have persistent nutritional impact, education, health, all of this can suffer, which can stay with you. Productive assets can be sold by micro businesses, which has supply side impacts again, and on future earnings there are effects. So all of these are medium to long run effects of the short run shock that we are seeing that need to be urgently addressed. Now, cash transfer is good. We haven't done enough. In fact, we should do more. However, we don't have the pipeline and infrastructure is a problem. The advantage of an employment guarantee is that it's a self-targeted program. What you need to ensure is that you start those works. Then everything else is about the people who will show up to those works. And we don't think that in this context, you're going to have any problem finding people who really need that. So you can target effectively to those people who need it, and it is going to go to them, unlike a lot of other kinds of things where leakages are a problem and so forth. So that's the short run reason why one should do something like a public works program right now. A cash transfer again would be great if it could be done effectively for everybody who really needs it. But again, the survey data show that Jan Dhan is not that effective. Right? Even among the holders, it doesn't reach everyone. And we have some numbers for that in our survey too. Now, quickly on the sort of longer run point, which goes back to Sajid Chinoy's point. What do we do when we put money in these programs? We have not from the beginning seen either NREGA or urban employment as doles. For us, they are investments in public goods. Now, why am I saying that? There is enough evidence, although there should be more because not enough work has been done, that where NREGA functions, it actually creates assets that are useful. The quality of assets can be a problem, yes. People can prioritize employment generation over asset creation, that does happen. But we all know that there's a severe dearth of public goods, not only in villages, but even more so in towns. We see this money spent in the long run as creating those very kind of public goods which long run growth needs to be inclusive, right? So there's no, there's no trade-off in the long run. There may be a trade-off right now that the rupee spent is not going to go in capex and employment guarantee, of course, but over the long run, it's going to crowd in investment because you're going to improve ease of doing business by doing all these things that you should have done in the first place. Basic things like roads and quality of life in the towns and commuting and things like that. So that would be my
Rajendran, I'm going to come back to you now, and I'm just I apologize, but I'd like you to repeat some of that data from the hunger survey. Very stark statistics. I'm reading from the text part that you had sent me. 53% reported that consumption of rice and wheat had decreased. 64% reported that consumption of dal had decreased. 73% reported that their consumption of green vegetables had decreased. And then you go on to, of course, detail that across different states, which may have been worst hit. And then I also noted that there was a chart on the share of people who had to take on debt to sort of fund food consumption. Very, very stark statistics.
Yeah, I think before we look at the nutrition, this particular statistic, I think I want to highlight one important fact is about the consumption expenditure survey, which is the pre-pandemic situation. So that should also give us a sense of comparison of how things were before the lockdown happened and how it has worsened since the lockdown. So if you look at the consumption expenditure survey was not, the last consumption expenditure survey was not released, but as per the leaked consumption expenditure survey, and if you rank the rural population from the poorest to the richest in groups of 10, in deciles, what you'll see is that the consumption has gone down in every decile of the population, which means throughout there is a uniformly people in rural India have become poorer because they are not able to consume as much. So that's the background in which the lockdown happened. Now, since lockdown, if you can go back to the statistics, you'll see that the situation is extremely grim in the sense that about 73% reported that the consumption of green vegetables has decreased, and for about 38%, it's decreased a lot. And similarly, just to quote a few more numbers, 64% reported that the consumption of dal has decreased, of which about 28% reported that it's decreased a lot. Now, these are, again, what happens is when the poor get affected, the first thing is they will compromise on the quality of food, because that's the quality of nutritious food, I mean. So obviously the first cut would be on, okay, I'm going to stop eating fruits, I'm going to stop eating green vegetables. So that's the first thing that gets a cut. Then they're going to say, okay, fine, now I've cut down. So with my limited resources, what else can I cut? So constantly the thing on their mind is, what do I cut? So fruits and vegetables are out. Eggs and meat automatically go out because they are more expensive. Milk consumption goes out. So what remains is your rice and dal. These are the main basic food grains. So thanks to the public distribution system, at least the consumption of rice and dal is not as low as, let's say, consumption. It has not decreased as much as the consumption of green vegetables, eggs, meat, milk, etc. And about 45% of them have reported that they had to borrow money for food, which is again a very grim thing to think about. Borrow money on a daily basis, and a significant proportion of them also had to go to bed without eating a meal. And that's again something, as in these are all pointing towards massive some kind of starvation or hunger, if you will. And again, as I said, the nutrition quality is more than 70%. So about 3 out of 4 people are saying that their quality and the quantity of food consumption has gone down. Now, if you combine this with the recent NFHS data that's come out, where child nutrition, where it talks about how the child malnutrition has been stagnant from 2015 till 2020. So we have entered a time when child malnutrition was already low, consumption was already very low, because since 2011 to 2018 it had gone down. There was a 9% decrease in the monthly per capita consumption expenditure, and now lockdown happened, April, May, complete decimation of wages, and subsequently in October you see further lowering of nutrition and quality of food. So what is really scary is that we are looking at an extremely stunted society going forward unless active policy measures are taken into consideration. Now, just to add one last point quickly, is that under the Pradhan Mantri's Garib Kalyan Yojana, there was provision extra rice, and there was a provision for extra rice for the ration card beneficiaries till the month of November, and that has been discontinued. What the Hunger Watch data reveals is that there is a need for that to continue for a longer period of time, because most people are continue to have there's been a massive loss of livelihoods and lack of food intake. So that needs to continue. And one last point I'll quickly make is the fact that even now migrant workers are not covered under the PDS, because many of them don't carry their ration cards where they are. And as per estimates by Jean Dreyes, Ritika Khera, and Meghna Mungikar, what we saw is that 100 million people who are eligible to be ration card beneficiaries, they are out of the ambit of the PDS right now. So many people, so this is the time to universalize PDS and not be constrained and cut.
Okay.
If I could just stay with you, Rajendran, on what is being discussed as the potential policy prescription for this. It is essentially in the nature of expanding PDS.
I would say it's important to universalize. So as Amit mentioned about the Urban Employment Guarantee Program as well, that it make it universal in the sense that if anyone can go to a ration shop and access food grains, people on this panel, you, me, Arjun, and Amit, will not go there and get ration. So the most needy will self-select and go and get ration. And as per data from the Food Corporation of India, the granaries are full. So we have, and this is before the harvest season. So post-harvest, we envision that there is much more food grains available in the FCI godowns that can actually, if universalized, the sense is that the top 15%, the top 15 richest households in the country would say opt out of getting rations from the PDS. So the bottom 85% of the population, we should give them free rice, grains, and dal, etc., so that they can go and access it. So one of the things is, when we say universalize, we mean make it open to everyone. And again, as the Mint article indicated today, is that there is a significant, I think about 50%, I'm forgetting the numbers, but 50% of the wealth is, a significant proportion of the wealth is held by the 10%, top 10% of the country. So they're obviously going to opt out and not take rations from PDS. So yeah, so universalization.
Absolutely. Amit, Arjun, in case any of you want to jump in, I think the suggestion also, which came from Alka Basu in an article which which we will soon publish, is that you need to look at vegetables, fruits, find a way, at least during stress times, to be able to push that through the PDS system. But again, I guess the question of finances, resources, the management of that process will continue to come up. Any of you want to pick up on that?
Arjun.
No, I mean it's fairly, there is another thing that we should sort of establish here. I think, is that I think when we talk about systems not working, I think it's also, and this is slightly more larger point. We use that as an excuse very often for not doing things. Clearly, we need to be spending more on income support and universalizing rations and so on. So and including, as you said, for making sure that nutrition is kept to the minimum levels that you would expect in a civilized society. But often in many of our discussions, we talk as if these are all wasteful, all unlikely to get to the beneficiaries. And I think that's a mistake right from the outset. So whatever we've built and we've built effectively, we ought to use the maximum extent possible and keep improving on that. I just feel like that's one of these points that people often make with in a sort of unjustifiable manner.
Oh, fair enough, and I didn't intend to suggest that at all. I will flip to the macros then sort of come back to budget. Arjun, I'll stay with you on this one. I think this time around there will be stark choices to be made. We've had a government which has been, according to most, very surprisingly restrained in terms of expenditure in a crisis year. Now, going into next year, I'm not sure what you think is an appropriate approach. I think others have said that you have to keep the expenditure to GDP at least at the levels of FY21, if not increase it, while reducing the fiscal deficit using things like asset sales, etc. But you're convinced that you do need a significant fiscal push in an economy like the one that we're living in?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's definitely a given. I also want to suggest that one of the things that was done very well, I think, 3 years ago with the NK Singh committee report was the move away from thinking of government finances in the very, very short term. The idea that you should be more or less balancing things year on year. I feel like we've regressed a little bit from that when we say that we have to keep the fiscal deficit under control by, say, asset sales and so on. In fact, if we really believe the multipliers, which, for example, the RBI puts out, and there've been estimates thereof, actually increasing expenditure, especially in a moment when there's no inflation right now, is not likely to actually raise debt to GDP ratios that much, especially if you have a more bang for the buck with things like capital expenditure and so on. So I think that we really ought to be thinking in at least a 3 to 5 year time frame, and not currently worry about this year's shortfall in terms of a fiscal deficit or a primary deficit.
That graphic on the screen, Arjun, is sort of a model that one of your colleagues has put together. You want to talk us through what it's suggesting, that perhaps we can go ahead with the right kind of expenditure while maintaining our trajectory on a lowering debt to GDP eventually?
Sure. This is work that's just going to be released soon by our colleague Ziko Dasgupta. And he was asking a very simple question. He says, look, suppose we are forced and we really do want to increase revenue expenditure, right? Continuing expenditure, not capital expenditure, by a certain amount, let's say 3 lakh crores, right? A certain amount that we want to increase it by. Can we do a judicious mix of, say, capital and non-capital expenditure, which have different multipliers that are associated with them, and still keep our central debt to GDP ratio roughly constant, 55% of GDP? And that's the thought experiment that he undertook. And he looked through the data and he said, look, actually you can. All right. So why is that the case? Because actually capital expenditure to GDP ratio has a high multiplier, and non-capital primary expenditure to GDP ratio, while it doesn't have that high a multiplier, is not a zero multiplier either, or a negative multiplier. So that in fact there will be a kick to the economy. So these are his estimates, which suggest the brown bars are just saying how much we can expand and in what proportion to each one of say capital expenditure, non-capital expenditure, and still roughly remain at 55% debt to GDP at the center. So the basic thing that seems very clear from this is, if you look at the last graph, primary expenditure to GDP ratio can go up by about around 3 percentage points of GDP, and we would still not actually see a very large increase in the debt to GDP ratio. So there is a lot more space than people are making out.
Okay, understood. As I wrap up this discussion, I've thrown a few specific questions your way, but I would like to hear from you as to, from all the research which all of you have done, read, what you think are some of the learnings and how that should inform not just budget 2021, that's too short a time frame, but at least the direction of policies. I'll start with you, Amit. Key takeaways from all the data and work that you have done that you think need the attention of policymakers.
Okay, that's all. So, So the short
Okay,
run
let me
is.
put it this way: if you have 10 minutes with the finance minister and there are three data points you want to tell her, which she knows will have to inform her budget, what are they going to be? I'm putting you on the spot there.
Well, so in the short run, there is unacceptably high unemployment at the lower end. We've already established that, and I'm putting it that way because the overall recovery numbers don't look bad, right? So you can sort of glass half full, glass half empty kind of thing. It's probably more than half full in an aggregate sense, but there is a lot hidden there under that aggregate number. That's what, as we've outlined. So there's a lot of unemployment and a lot of financial hardship and insecurity, food insecurity at the lower end, which needs immediate attention. And for that, what we've been talking about is basically the same things. Universalize periods, extend some more direct cash support, fund Manrega as much as the demand exists, and introduce something in the towns also equivalent to that. And these four, I think, are still remaining good points in the short run. So I would definitely emphasize that. But this is not going to be enough, because obviously we want a society where people don't depend on subsidized food or even for that matter on public workfare. Right? These are all things that we recognize to be fallback options when the private economy does not give you a dignified, secure livelihood. So going forward, that remains the holy grail as always. How do we generate those dignified and secure livelihoods? And there, I mean, there's a lot to be said, but let me just say, a couple of things. One, everybody talks about this, the MSME sector. It's sort of always mentioned as a job engine and so forth. Now, in that, the micro and small segment has really, really been affected badly, something we didn't talk about today. But there's a lot of data out there if people want to look at it. Micro and small enterprises have suffered terribly. Many of them are shut down. IFMR Lead did a survey. AIMO, All India Manufacturers Organization, has done a larger survey. We had a lot of shutdowns, bankruptcies, all of these things. They are outside many times the official the formal liquidity net. So ECLGS did not reach them. In fact, ECLGS money wasn't even fully spent, which is a separate issue. So we had, liquidity-based measures did not work. These enterprises are really the hope going forward for, mass generation of livelihoods. It's not the corporate sector, which has a very low elasticity to begin with and is small also. So in the long run, I would say there's solid attention is needed on the micro and small segment of the MSMEs, because the medium actually does reasonably well. And some other time maybe we can talk about what those specific policy approaches there can be.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't gotten into MSC. I haven't gotten into taxation as well. There is a whole constituency that believes that this is the time that you want to get into wealth tax or, an even higher rate for some of the top income earners. But that's a separate debate. Rajendran, do you want to add to what Amit said? Certainly, it looks like there's no excuse not to widen the definition or the thinking on food security.
I would definitely like to add one thing. So one of the things that the entire migrant worker crisis revealed to us is the complete absence of any social protection measure. And by that, I not just mean for the fact that there is lack of food security, the fact that healthcare is not universalized. Now, many of them, they have to pay so much money to get, so many of them during the migrant worker crisis, because their incomes were so low, they were compromising. Even if they had fever or any other kind of ailment, they were not in a position to get medicines for it because they didn't have the resources to buy medicines. So I think what this entire pandemic and lockdown has definitely shown us is the need to widen the social protection measures. And there is a NCEUS had, I think in 2008, come up with a very wonderful list. Professor Ravi Srivastava, who was part of the NCUS, who wrote that entire paper, their recommendations of widen social protection measures, I think the time is right for us to adopt those measures. This was in 2008. This was the Arjun Gupta Commission report. And why can't we implement all of them? So universalize rations, definitely double. And even before the lockdown happened in early January 2020, many of us had talked about that the Narega budget for pre-lockdown in the country should have been about 1 lakh crore. And even after the fiscal stimulus that happened by the finance minister, it went up to 1 lakh crore. So that, and we see that although many more people are completing 100 days of work this year compared to all the previous years, but still there is a high unmet demand. So, and that unmet demand is happening because of lack of adequate support system for Narega. So definitely increase the budgets for Narega, universalize rations. And one important critical thing is provision of eggs as part of midday meals. In many states, eggs are not being provided as part of midday meals. So it's very critical because that's the single most important source of protein for children. And we need to really push for that.
And the money for all this, Arjun, just has to be found, perhaps also in the context of how the global debate on fiscal policy has changed, right? I mean, in India, we're not speaking so much about it for the fear of, rating agencies and outflows, etc. But the globe is moving in a different direction, when it comes to fiscal policy, debt to GDP ratio. Some of those old thinkings, perhaps we'll have to rethink as well.
Yes, I mean, clearly there's two or three things, if I may. So clearly, as we just heard from, Lawrence Boone and, earlier from Olivia Blanchard and every other macroeconomist in the West, they're rethinking clearly what actually fiscal support can do, and whether in fact one really needs to worry as long as interest rates are low, which, I think interest rates being a policy variable, I think it's very important for us to actually think more carefully about monetary fiscal coordination. But I'm going to take you up, Ira, on this thing about what I'd say, if we had 10 minutes. And I'm afraid that I don't have, anything to say about the current moment, because really, in some sense, we it's all hands to deck. Anything that we can and should do to support people, the hundreds of million people who have been destroyed whose livelihoods have been destroyed by this pandemic, we should. But I have a sort of medium-term concern. I really think that unless we solve that, this is, we're going to roll from crisis to crisis, which is where is the growth going to come from? In the last 5-6 years, we've actually seen this plateauing of growth. And really, there's no dynamism that I can see that's present in the economy. Is this malaise due to the twin balance sheet problem, inflation targeting, lack of animal spirits in this, currently? So I would say that while we have to keep an eye to the short term and all the things we need to do, what I'd really like to see, and going forward, is some sort of vision which is sort of inclusive and forward-looking in the medium and long term about all these kind of aspects of welfare, health, education, environment, another big concern that we have going forward. And in the past, we've had a situation when we've looked at other countries and and which have made this transition to more advanced economies. They've always had some element of industrial policy, thinking through how they're actually going to shift their populations from low productivity to high productivity. Currently, I think we're doing things with a hope and a prayer, and our growth models have fizzled out so far. And really, what we're looking for is something in the next 3 to 5 years, which will be aimed at reopening new markets, more inclusion, and really ensuring the welfare of a much, much, much larger fraction of the population than we're currently doing.
And perhaps accept, Arjun, that some of the age-old things that we've been trying for, manufacturing share of GDP, push up exports. I mean, we've spoken about them for years, if not decades, and they're not working. And so I think, as you said, and as others like Rajendran have said, we need a growth model. We need to know what that great growth model is going to look like in the next 10 years or so.
That's right.
All right. All right, I'm going to use that to close off this discussion. Sorry, wide subject, so we've only scratched the surface, but really kind of all of you join us here and help us detail some of the statistics that have come through in the last 6 to 9 months, and then help us set the stage for perhaps some focus on this debate in the budget. Thanks so much for watching BloombergQuint.
Thank you very much.